Our next speaker is a member of our very own Warwick Economics Department. She studied at the University of Delhi and moved on to earn her master's degree and PhD from the University of Oxford. She has worked globally and has contributed to institutions such as the International Economics Association and London Centre for Economic Policy Research, amongst many others. Professor Sonia Bhalotra is an applied economist working to deepen our understanding of the role of the family, legal, and political environment, focusing on skill creation and early childhood development. She brilliantly relates this to her main areas of interest: labor and econometrics, history, development, as well as the political economy. She was recently selected to be one of the winners of the European Research Council grant and was the joint principal investigator for a project on intimate partner violence. Currently, Professor Bhalotra has been working for a project for the ESRC Research Centre for Microsocial Change. Today, she will be educating us on the long-run impacts of infant health on cognitive performance, life expectancy, and earnings. Professor Sonia Bhalotra, welcome to the summit.
Thank you, Iman, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, and I only joined Warwick a year ago, so I'm delighted to be able to participate in this way. So I welcome your questions. I'm going to talk today primarily about this research that's joined with Martin, Therese, and Nina, named here, which looks at identifying the long-run impacts of investing in infant health on future outcomes, including school performance, earnings, and life expectancy. It's going to use the experimental variation generated by a program that was launched during the period when the welfare state was being developed in Sweden in the 30s. But before I launch into the actual paper, some background. So this plot here is called the Heckman Curve, and it basically illustrates James Heckman's thesis, which is based on research across disciplines, including psychology, that there are higher returns to investments earlier in life than later in life. So the vertical axis here plots the rate of return to policy investments. The first bar on the x-axis marks the prenatal period, and as you move from left to right on the x-axis, the individual is aging. So at the very right end of the plot, the individual is an adult, and you have policy interventions like training, which have relatively small returns. And at the top end, you have, for example, prenatal and early postnatal programs, such as we're going to discuss. So why do returns to early investments exceed returns to later interventions? There are two main reasons. There's greater developmental plasticity in the early years of life. So the individual is still developing, and there's more room for response in terms of metabolic and endocrine processes. The other reason, which continues across the life course, is that investment tends to beget investment. In other words, there is a dynamic in self-productivity. For both of these reasons, investing in childhood health yields benefits over the life course. And of course, then the earlier you start, the greater the scope for this cumulative effect. Now, just to sort of set the stage, consider evidence on policies addressing infectious disease in childhood, because I want to focus on what's going on in childhood. So in one paper with Athene Venkataramani, we looked at the innovation of antibiotics in 1936, the very first antibiotics. They were called sulfonamides, and they were launched in America in 1937. They were described in the New York Times as a miracle drug, and it was the first time that people were familiar with the notion of a life-saving drug. There was wide uptake, and there followed a very sharp drop in child mortality from pneumonia, which was the leading cause of child death. And pneumonia tends to attack very young children and very old people. So the age curve is U-shaped. So there was a sharp drop in child mortality from pneumonia, which in turn, we show, caused a sharp increase in education and income among cohorts born in the post-antibiotic era. In a similar design, we looked at a water chlorination policy. Mexico implemented this policy very rapidly as cholera was approaching from neighboring countries. So it saw this epidemic at its doorstep. It reacted swiftly, chlorinated its water supplies quite comprehensively within 6 months, and there was about a 50% drop in child mortality from diarrhea, which is a waterborne disease. We showed that this caused a sharp increase in measures of intelligence, which varied from home-based IQ tests to school test scores conducted through the PISA assessments. So the idea in these studies was to compare later life outcomes for birth cohorts that benefited from the policy with birth cohorts born just before who failed to be exposed to it. In both cases, we used sort of further causal identification approaches, essentially leveraging the policy event as a quasi-experiment. That work is relevant today because pneumonia and diarrhea are still the leading causes of death. Pneumonia is treatable with antibiotics, and diarrhea risk can be mitigated through water chlorination. Nevertheless, about 2.2 billion people globally don't have access to safe water, and only 20% of children who need antibiotics access them. Why is there this policy failure? Although child mortality is a policy target, i.e. policymakers care about bringing it down, policymakers do not recognize the long-term damage that early life infectious disease exposure has on survivors. So there are these people who survive death in infancy, and they go on to be scarred by infection in their early childhood, and that scarring manifests in lower educational attainment and lower earnings. I'm going to show you now, if I can manage the technology, a video describing the research on clean water.
Waterborne diseases such as diarrhea.
Sorry, that's not the beginning. Yes.
Access to clean water is a basic human right. Yet 750 million people around the world, that's 9.7% of the world's population, do not have access to a close source of it. Although the water they are therefore forced to drink may quench their thirst, it is extremely dangerous, more than you may think. And here's why. You may already know about the diseases that derive from dirty water. It is estimated that each year there are more than 2 million deaths from waterborne diseases such as diarrhea, which is actually the second leading cause of child death in the entire world. But dirty water doesn't only take lives away. It also can permanently decrease a person's quality of life, something not captured by the death rate. Infancy is when brain growth is at its fastest. 90% of brain development happens before the age of 5. To feed this rapid brain growth, infants need a lot of nutrition. As much as 80% of the calories consumed by a baby go to brain development. Infancy is also when rates of diarrhea infections are highest. This is due to a child's underdeveloped immune system. So when an infant consumes unclean water containing pathogens, they get a stomach infection, which leads to diarrhea. So before nutrition is extracted, food and water are washed out by the illness. As a result, the infant is undernourished, compromising brain development. Since after age 1, it is hard to catch up on brain development, shown by this graph, The illness in the first year of the child's life can lead to that person having an underdeveloped brain for the rest of their lives. And remember, this all began with the unclean water. Effectively, those with access to clean water may have larger and better developed brains. If everyone had access to a better water supply, rates of inequality may rapidly decrease. So charities such as WaterAid bring much more than just water to some of the world's poorest people.
Okay, I hope that worked. Coming back here. That video was made by my daughter when she was about 13, and I told her about this research. So now moving on to today's agenda, we're motivated by the fact that we don't yet fully understand the mechanisms or the key levers. Why exactly does a healthy child grow up to earn more or live longer than a less healthy child? We study in this paper the health and economic impacts of an infant health intervention trialed in Sweden between 31 and 33. It's a historical policy, and this allows us to track individuals from birth to death. We digitized and linked individual administrative data that had the entire population of births in these years and the neighboring years. And the data allow us to study school performance, labor market outcomes, pensions, and the cause of death. These sorts of data are most unusual, and they allow us to advance analysis of mechanisms. So the research I'll discuss here is based on two publications, one in the GIA and one that is forthcoming this year. The first focuses on life expectancy and the next on the economic outcomes. So what was this intervention? It was pioneering. It was a pillar of the emerging welfare state, that led subsequently to a national rollout across the Scandinavian countries, and the rest of Europe and America followed suit. So now we all have sort of universal pre- and postnatal care in OECD countries, but this was the beginning. It was universal, which is important. It was no fee, and it was targeted at newborns. It included home visits by trained nurses and the setting up of additional clinics. Together, these provided information, support, and monitoring. There was an emphasis on breastfeeding, sanitation, and diet. All of these interventions limit infections and help to catch other problems early. The contemporary relevance of this is clear. Universal health coverage is thought of as the fourth demographic transition. It's right there at the top of the public health agenda today, and child and maternal health mark universality. There is a surge in funding for such programs in low and middle income countries, but as a paper by Engel, which is now about 10 years old, 15 years old, indicates there's been very little evaluation. The work is also relevant to richer countries with, for example, the UK and the US seeking recently to expand and refurbish the family nurse partnership programs. Just a picture of UHC. Now, I've been arguing that what we need to sort of cross the current frontier is to understand mechanisms. So what are the potential mechanisms? This was partly discussed through my daughter's video. Infancy is a time when the velocity of human growth is at its highest. Part of that is neurological growth or brain development. In infancy, as much as 85% of calorie intake is directed towards developing the brain. The brain actually doubles in size in infancy, in other words, between birth and the age of 12 months. And by age 3, it's at 80% of its adult volume, and by age 5 at 90%. What infection does is to command nutrients away from neurological growth. It distracts from the growth process. Infection also creates inflammation as a sort of survival response, and inflammation can affect gene expression. So there can be epigenetic changes, which then affect you for life. We showed that this simple health intervention I described raises school test scores, a marker of brain development, as much as direct educational interventions like reducing class size or increasing teacher pay. Now, why might infant health lead to higher employment and earnings? Well, first, because an improved cognitive endowment is relevant to future earnings, but this biological endowment can be reinforced by behavioral processes, essentially by further investments in the cognitively endowed individual. These can be own investments, parent investments, or state investments. So why would own investments improve? We say because of a lower cost of effort. So children who are, let's say, intelligent, I know it's a loaded word, but children who are intelligent find it easier to study, so they study more. If I'm good at tennis, I'm going to be more likely to play tennis more often because I enjoy things I'm good at and find them easy. There's some evidence that parents reinforce child endowments. So if you've got a child who's showing a lot of potential, you put more time and money into them. There's also some evidence of compensation. So this isn't a science, but there is some evidence of reinforcing behaviors. And then in this paper, one thing I emphasize is that a child who is well endowed can compete more effectively for state investments in education that often are rationed, and certainly in this historical setting were rationed. In fact, in contrast to existing work, which basically projects early life health onto later life earnings with a black box in the middle, by being able to look at the intermediate steps in the life course, we're also able to identify the barriers to the full realization of returns to investment in health. We emphasize in particular institutional constraints, marked in this study by school capacity, and demand constraints, marked by labor market demand for skilled women or men. And finally, the third sort of package of mechanisms, why would infant health lead to lower chronic disease? So in a fight to survive, infants who are challenged by infection or undernutrition, any sort of assault on the routine growth process, can become programmed with latent metabolic traits that are predictive of chronic disease. So an example that's possibly more accessible than others is that using cohort data from the famines in Ireland, Nigeria, China, and the Dutch hunger winter, so using famine events across history, people have shown that survivors of famine are obesity prone. And the reason it's thought is that the ones who survive a famine are selectively individuals with a thrifty gene. A thrifty gene is a gene that can take you through a lean period. So basically there's selection into survival, and that type of adaptation that the individual makes as a baby to survive when there's limited resources means that they're maladapted to plenty. So they get adapted to scarcity, then they grow up into sort of non-famine periods, and they're not adapted for that sort of diet, so they become prone to obesity. So that was one example, but there are more, but that is how the biology sort of works. This is important because chronic disease accounts for more than 2/3 of global deaths today. And the implication of this sort of causal link running from infections in early childhood to chronic disease risk in adulthood is that it's much less expensive to put in place simple preventive care after birth than it is to have expensive treatments for chronic disease. And this is, of course, on top of all the well-being issues of suffering chronic disease. Now I'm going to launch, this was a sort of long introduction. Now going to launch into the nitty-gritty of the Sweden research. So we got together this administrative individual longitudinal data that allow us to track individuals of a given set of cohorts right from birth through to death. We accessed birth records from church parishes, which were in paper form, school registers also in paper from archives. We used the digitized census files of more recent years, digitized tax registers, and also the death register. We did the matching over time between these different registers using the full name, the exact birth date, and the parish of birth. We ended up with a data set where we observe individuals as they're born, at age 10 as they finish primary school, at age 39, which is for the marginal individual born in 1931, but observed in the 1970 census, they're 39, and in the pension register at 71. We then also know the date when they died. And living to, say, the age of 75 was an achievement for these cohorts. So I probably don't need to say much more, because I'm going to show you that the results of exposure to this infant program were differentiated by gender. It's important to say that the matching of the data over time was similar by gender, and attrition, which means, for example, that some school records were not available because they'd been lost in a fire in the archive to match with the birth records, that sort of attrition was balanced by gender. So in other words, the differences we see by gender are not an artifact of the data, but appear to be genuine. This is a photograph of school data that my co-author Martin Carlson, he's Swedish, but he lives in Germany. So a little army of undergraduates in Germany digitized these data for I think a handsome fee. Now, you know that economists care to distinguish causation from correlation. So we approached the challenge of identifying causal effects essentially by leveraging eligibility rules. So children were eligible for this postnatal program for the time that they were age 0 to 12. So they were eligible at birth and stopped being eligible sharply at age 12. So what this picture shows you is how the month and year of birth laid out on the x-axis varies with the duration of exposure, and the first age at exposure marked on the y-axis. So for example, if you were born 6 months before the program started, you were eligible for the last 6 months of your infancy. And if you were born 6 months before it ended, you were eligible for the first 6 months of your infancy. We're going to define exposure duration, months exposed, as the treatment. Now, this program was a trial. It was the first in the world, and the Swedish government explicitly announced it as a trial. They said, we're going to start this sort of experiment in 7 districts, in 52 parishes and 2 cities, and we're going to switch it off in 1933. So the government identified the treated districts to be representative of the country, and we checked that using pre-reform census files, that it's indeed representative. And then we follow a statistical procedure called Mahalanobis matching, which essentially draws from the untreated cities and parishes those that are precise matches to the treated parishes on a range of observables. The empirical strategy, which I don't need you to read in any detail, essentially consists of regressing a future outcome for an individual child, like their school test score, on an indicator for whether they were born in a parish that was treated with a program and the months of exposure they had to that program. We also allow for differences according to the age at exposure. So if they were, for example, only exposed from the age of 3 months because they were already born when the program arrived. We do numerous tests to establish that the variation in policy or program exposure is quasi-experimental. For example, we look at whether there was selection into uptake of the program, whether parents were more likely to have a child because there was a facility to protect that child's survival. We look at whether the treated and untreated districts were possibly already on divergent trajectories in terms of outcomes like test scores, in which case, if they were, we might misattribute to the program a tendency that was existing before the program. So now I'm going to show you the results. These pictures show you the distribution, show you the impacts of the program on the distribution of test scores. So at the very back of the slides, I have the actual distribution of test scores. And all I want you to know from that is that in the 1930s in Sweden, girls had higher average test scores than boys in any case before the program. Then the program arrived, and basically these pictures tell you, and if you do a simple regression, you see that on balance, on average, children did better at school if they were born after this program. But we looked at, I'm not showing you tables because figures are more fun, but we looked at how the impact of the program varied across the distribution of test scores. Boys are described on the left-hand side. The solid line is the plot of the treatment effect coefficients, and the dotted curves are the confidence intervals around that solid line. The red horizontal bar marks 0. So if the coefficients were to lie on the 0 bar, it would tell us that the program was ineffective. There was a 0 treatment effect. The fact that the black curve lies above the red line communicates that across the distribution of test scores, boys saw an improvement in test scores. The curve on the right-hand side has a different shape. You see that up till about the 60th percentile of the test score distribution, girls didn't see higher achievement. However, at the top of the distribution, they did. Now, these distributions are specific to boys on the left and girls on the right. What we did was to pool the distribution to see where girls lay relative to boys. And we did that by creating, we put the test scores of both boys and girls together. Then we took the top 20% and created an indicator for whether your test score is at the top of the distribution. We then followed a statistical procedure, which is called an event study, to look at how over time, exposure to the program marked by these vertical lines. So the first vertical line on the graph is 1931. The second vertical line is 1933. And essentially, boys are not more likely to be in the top 20% of the grade point average, but girls are. So that intervention basically made everyone do better, but specifically pushed girls differentially into the top scoring region. Now that's very relevant, not only on its own, but because of what it leveraged. At this time, secondary schools were still being built. Primary school was universal. Only 20% of children who completed primary progressed to secondary. Because the secondary places were limited, entry was competitive. Now, this plot is simply the raw data. We haven't done any black box regression work here. And the raw data shows you very clearly this steep rise. Sorry, I haven't explained. The vertical axis is the probability of going to secondary school, and the horizontal axis is your primary school test score percentile. So here is 80%, where the bubbles start to sharply go up is 80%. So if you lie in the top 20% of the test score distribution, your chances of going to secondary school sharply escalate. And we see this for both genders. So basically, because girls scored in the top of the distribution and you needed that to go to secondary school, girls were more likely to go to secondary school. Here we test the fact of the claim we have of competition by we used maps. We knew where those secondary schools were exactly. We created with a map a radius around the secondary school as a sort of plausible catchment area. And we looked at the share of children. It says share treated females, but it should say children. We looked at the share of treated children in your catchment area for the secondary school you would like to go to. And that creates a measure of competition for places. And we find that girls, I don't have time to describe this in detail, but for those of you who are interested in methods, I'm very happy to in Q&A. But essentially, along the x-axis is the percentage of children treated, which is marking competition for the school in your area. The gray lines are for boys and the dark ones for girls. And we see that basically girls displace boys in this competition. So to summarize, there are treatment effects or effects of the exposure to the infant program on boys' test scores, and the average increase is of 0.1 standard deviations. However, only girls are more likely to score in the top quintile and by a significant 12.4 percentage points. They're also 3.5 percentage points more likely to attend secondary school. So, and we demonstrate that this is because of capacity constraints. Moving on to labor market outcomes of the same individuals. Remember, we're tracking them through school, and then we have their school registers where we know their name and date of birth. Then we find that same person in the census files in 1970, where they're potentially working and they report earnings. If they report zero earnings because they're not working, they're still in here with zero earnings. So these pictures for men on the left and for women on the right are constructed similarly to the test score distributions that I discussed before, but now these are distributions of earnings. They're the quantiles of income, and on the vertical axis is the treatment effect. So since the black line marking the treatment effects across the distribution for men is indistinguishable from the red line marking a zero effect, basically men don't see any gains in terms of earnings. So they do better at school, but they don't earn more when they grow up, which is somewhat surprising and which we discuss in the paper in great detail. Women, however, there's no increase in the chances that women are earning in the bottom 50% of the distribution, but there's a very marked increase in the share of women earning in the top half of the distribution. And the broad pattern looks very much like the test score distribution with this jump for women at the top, making it plausible that the test scores are driving the earnings. But what the test scores did in this setting was also to allow these girls to continue to secondary school. The analog of that today would be to continue in college. It's just that in the 30s, the relevant margin was secondary school. So we do what we did before. We pool the distribution for men and women, and we define an indicator for being at the top 20%. And you see that men are not more likely to be in that region, but women are. To summarize, we see a large increase in women's earnings. Why is it so large? I haven't told you the percentage, but it's bordering 20%. It's partly that some women actually went from earning 0 to earning some large positive number, so you get very large percentage increases because of the extensive margin. Using regional variation, which I haven't discussed or shown you because of time scarcity, but using the fact that the labor market was different across Swedish regions at the time, we demonstrate that the demand for women workers was driven by the fact that at this time the welfare state was expanding, and it coincided the demand for women as teachers, midwives, health workers, and managers of administrative departments shot up just as these women with the higher skills generated by the program were emerging on the labor market. We find when we do a lot of work with the census also to identify the occupations they work in, and we find that almost all of the increase in women's employment is in the public sector and primarily in teaching and health, also some in management. So these increases clearly reduced gender wage gaps and gender participation gaps. In general, when we look at history or we look across countries today and we see a shrinking of gender gaps in labor market outcomes, we tend to think of the usual suspects. Women did better than men. Maybe there was childcare expansion. Maybe gender norms had suddenly crossed a threshold. But we have data on a childcare expansion in Sweden, and we also measure gender norms. One always uses a proxy, but we measure gender norms using information we got on the historical share of female mayors in the district in which the individual woman was living. We find no evidence that these measures of childcare expansion or gender norms were propelling women into the labor market. Instead, we do find substantive evidence that it was this exposure to infant health that had a persistent effect 30 years later. It gave them the skills, and it so happened that this was like a coincidence. The same program that provided them with infant health, sorry, not the same program, but the fact that that was part of the welfare state, that was the beginning. The welfare state was beginning to form in the 1930s, but by the 1950s and 60s, it had expanded to include midwifery. As I said, schools were expanding, secondary schools were being built. And I think there's a general point here about expanding the welfare state, which is what middle-income countries are doing big time now. They're expanding provision, essentially, of health and education. And it was very much the case in Sweden, but it remains pretty much the case today, that teachers and health workers tend to be women. So doctors may be balanced, men and women, but nurses tend to be women, and midwives and teachers. So I'm going to wrap up the sort of technical discussion very soon. This is the last slide. So we had the advantage with these data of the tracking over time. And we saw test scores, secondary school, skilled occupations, employment, all of these go up. If we think of earnings as the end point, it is the end point in terms of age, or the time at which these outcomes are revealed. If we think of earnings as the end point, we then asked, how much did it matter that you had secondary school? Or was it enough to have secondary school? Did it matter which occupation you chose? And we do a type of decomposition analysis, and it basically turns out that these life stage outcomes that we measure account for 50% of the increase in earnings, which actually is quite a lot in terms of statistical my statistical experience, because there's a lot of noise, a lot of luck, and so on. But if we take secondary schooling out of the equation, that 50% falls to 11%. That's one way of measuring how important the lever of secondary school was. And that in turn helps us explain the differential effects for women. But secondary school, we know, depended on test scores, and we find that test scores explain 70% of the treatment effect on secondary. So a summary of these results. This low-cost intervention, delivered by lightly trained nurses that are available in large numbers in poor countries. You just need to train people to deliver information, for example, on breastfeeding and diet. So you don't need pediatricians. It's not expensive. So this low-cost intervention transformed the lives of post-intervention cohorts and contributed in broad terms to longevity and economic growth decades later. It had an immediate effect on health, lowering the infant death rate by 24%. It also had a lasting impact on health for those who survived, because they were less likely to succumb to cancer, cardiovascular disease, and infections. And these health gains were broadly similar for men and women. This work constitutes the first large-scale causal evidence outside a lab that infection and diet in childhood can contribute causally to chronic disease. We also find that school performance improved, that primary school test scores improved for boys and girls, that girls did especially well and were able to progress to secondary school. And of course, if there were more secondary schools, boys may have also chosen to progress, but possibly at lower rates because of their lower achievement. This is new evidence of impacts of infant health that highlights the importance of looking not at the mean, but at the distribution of test scores. We also find that there was an improvement across the board of types of labor market outcomes, but only for women. And we argue that this is two-edged. It's driven by the supply of skill, because we know that women got those skills. It also did matter that demand conditions favored women. The growth in demand was for workers to serve in the welfare state provisions. This is the first evidence that if you expand the welfare state, as many poorer countries are now doing, this will increase the demand for women in skilled positions. The broad conclusions. There's a recent policy emphasis on preschool stimulation. This has been led by James Heckman. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He's been arguing that if you want to cognitively stimulate children, you need to kind of start well before they go to school. It's already too late when they arrive in school. And there are some key studies indicating, for example, by Orazio Atanasio at UCL and other colleagues, that if you train, for example, mothers or just encourage mothers to read to their child, to sing, and to talk to their child, it can make a big difference to the child's development as they progress through school. But we come in and show that a sort of more standard, simple preschool health intervention can have similarly large effects. We illuminate the mechanisms linking infant health to earnings, and we argue that there are potentially large effects as evidenced by the women, but they do depend on institutional capacity and market demand. And so if we did intervene in early childhood, we should also think about building the institutions to enable skill development and creating the demand for those skills. So when this program was funded, the policymakers wrote documents which my Swedish co-authors have read as they're in Sweden. And they explicitly talked about the aim of this intervention to be to limit infant mortality which had been declining in the years before 1930, but in the run-up to 1930, the decline had stalled. And policymakers, demographers noticed this and worried. There was also, on account of the war, there was also a concern about population sizes declining. So their aim was really to stop children dying. But it turns out that this program had benefits well over and above its target across domains, not just on health, but on education and productivity. And so the rate of return to investing in infant health turned out to be much higher than is commonly recognized. For example, the Copenhagen Consensus involves a group of academics and policymakers meeting and trying to rank investments. They try to say, will we get more for $1 in clean water provision or more for $1 in climate change endeavors. Using the data that I've just shown you, we estimate a very high internal rate of return of 22%. The return to schooling, the return to, say, going to college in America, is estimated to be around 10%. And one reason for this much larger return is that we start earlier, and then we have all this self-productivity, the virtuous cycle, over the life course. Now, I'm happy to actually be interrupted by Iman and stop when you would like me to, but I just wanted, okay, I'm happy to stop. I can show you more stuff that's at the back of the slides, but I can also do that in the course of our discussion. Okay.
Anything is fine. Thank you so much for that speech. You've certainly left us with a lot to think about, and that is very evident by the questions I have coming through for you. One of the most highly prioritized one, according to our viewers, is that Scandinavian education tends to prioritize those students that lag behind. Won't high-performing students feel unchallenged or unstimulated in this environment?
So I think that this isn't quite right. Like, it's certainly true that the Scandinavian countries are a bit more what you might call socialist or inclusive. So they try to make sure that no one is left behind. But it's also the case that they can include sort of differentiated, in Britain it's called ability streaming, but they can include differentiated teaching within a classroom. I have to say that I've not lived in Sweden, so I'm not familiar with the details of this, but I have had a child go through the British system, and the British system also has sort of slogans about not leaving any child behind, and they do some streaming. They try to pull at both ends.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, what do you think is the impact of lockdowns on pre-adolescent cognitive development? And how should parents invest in their children to help them gain resources and skills to cope with the repercussions of the pandemic?
Yeah. So actually, I, like many academics, I love to talk about research. So I'll generalize in a minute. But what jumps to my mind when you say that is I've recently been using Danish register data, so similarly rich administrative data on the entire population, looking at adolescent school achievement as a function of mental health. It's not set in the pandemic era. It's a bunch of about 20 years of child cohorts where we know whether, because we have all this linked data, we know whether a child had antidepressants between the age of 8 and 15, and then we have their test score in a national exam at age 16, and we find that being treated for depression does actually increase test scores, although only in maths, not in Danish, the language, and only for girls, not for boys so much. And I say this because I want to emphasize that an important impact the pandemic has had on young people, and especially teenagers, is to challenge their mental health. And we know that mental health is very bad for well-being and relationships and so on, but it's also bad for school performance and can set you back. So it's very important to recognize that there are mental health impacts of the pandemic, but also the treating mental health does work. This is important because there's debate about whether antidepressants are okay to use for children. I must be careful not to say I know that antidepressants are all good. They may have side effects that are not good, and we're working on this. But one thing we did find is that they are good for school test scores, and presumably if you do better at school, you're also feeling generally better. I don't
Thank
know
you
if
for
you
that.
want me to say more, but maybe you can ask me again.
Sure. I think we can come back to that. There's quite a few questions here for you. Our next one is, what actions would you suggest be taken to encourage governments to place a greater value on early childhood development?
So I think the actions that governments can take are essentially to provide more comprehensive, more universal prenatal and postnatal support for women. In Britain, the Family Nurse Partnership is a pretty good program that recently has been positively evaluated, but it's targeting vulnerable women who are essentially giving birth very early, like young mothers who are often single and poor. And that's great. But I think that it's not only the most vulnerable mothers who could benefit. And in a country as well endowed as Britain, we should be able to afford a universal program that supports women through that early period, because it has all these spin-off benefits for the child. And I
Thank you
think
for
maybe
that. Sorry?
I wish I knew. I don't think I can tell you the exact statistic, but the share of women who breastfeed in Britain is not high, and so it does include many women who are not particularly vulnerable. So presumably they don't recognize the importance of breastfeeding, and information is cheap. So just more information on the importance of early life could make a large difference.
I see. Thank you. Um, our next question is, what role, if any, does the rise of technology and digitalization have on cognitive development?
Um, so there is some debate about the extent to which the use of social media, which is a spin-off of the rise of technology, is distracting children. But there's also some fairly careful evidence indicating that, as with anything else, it depends on how it's used and regulated. So the fact that children have access to AI, like when we were young, we didn't have access to Google, but my daughter has learned a lot of Google and can draw maps and find things and look up statistics on anything she wants. So I think there are pluses and minuses. And as with debates such as, should we decode the gene, should we allow technology to take its course, I would say we should always allow progress, but then we need to regulate it.
I see. Thank you. Is there any way that these effects can be remedied with adequate therapy in later life? If so, is it only possible for a certain period of time, or does brain plasticity allow for older individuals to be aided as well? I think for
This is a really good question, and it's a question that's really is sort of the next question in this literature. People have raised this question in this sort of scholarly discussion. In general, we know that it's harder to intervene when children are older. Sorry, it's a sort of common sense answer, but it is the truth. It's harder. You achieve lower success rates, but you still can achieve change. And one example was the antidepressants, although I don't want to focus entirely on them, but they were delivered to children between the ages of 8 and 15, and they made a difference. There's an important high-profile study done by a group in Germany which involved essentially attaching to high school children a mentor from a better off family, so a more advantaged family, a friend. And this friend would pair up with the child. They would be, maybe the child would be 16 and the mentor or friend would be 18 or 20, so they would be like friends. But the fact that this older child was from an advantaged background and also a bit older had very large positive impacts on the chances that the younger child aspired to go to university and did well at school. So that was really easy to do. The effects are very clear, and it was a randomized controlled trial, so I'd say it was good evidence. So that is a nice example of how intervening late can work.
Thank you so much for that.